Good afternoon. Welcome in the session, the STI session on open metadata, open meta of scholarly outputs. Thank you all for joining. My name is Ludo Waltman. I'm affiliated with the Center for Science and Technology Studies, CWTS, at Leiden University in the Netherlands. So the topic of today's session is openness of metadata of scholarly outputs, and in particular research articles in the journal literature and more generally in conference proceedings, in books, etc. This is an area in which we have seen many interesting developments over the past few years. There's lots of things are going on, many new opportunities for all of us, I would say, for scientometricians, for research evaluators. It's important for all of us, I believe, to be aware of what's happening and perhaps even to contribute yourself. So just to give you a very brief introduction before we go to our speakers, let me summarize some of these developments that have recently taken place. We have seen last year in 2020, we have seen the launch of the initiative for open abstracts. This is an initiative that is asking scientific publishers to make the abstracts of the articles they publish openly available, not just on the websites, of their journals, but also in infrastructures, and in particular in the Crossref infrastructure. And many publishers have decided over the past year to join the initiative for open abstracts, and they have made lots of abstracts openly available in Crossref. And we can all now make use of these open abstracts. We can use them, for instance, for scientometric analysis. And this is a highly valuable resource. And there are many other publishers that are still in the process of deciding whether or not they will join the Open Abstracts initiative. And of course, we hope they will all do this. Something else that happened last year, that was also a major development, and I guess that many of you are familiar with this, is the decision that was made by Elsevier to join the initiative for open citations and to make all their citation data for Elsevier journals openly available. So the reference lists of Elsevier journals, of articles in Elsevier journals, have all been made openly available, again in Crossref. So anyone now has access to these references. Anyone can use them to perform bibliometric, scientometric analysis, and to do so in a transparent way based on open data, which offers many new opportunities for developing new types of bibliometric analysis, and also for making research evaluation more responsible. Other publishers have made similar steps. For instance, also last year we saw the American Chemical Society opening its citations. Something else that happened and that has triggered a lot of discussion is the decision that was made by Microsoft Academic to discontinue their tool, their platform. So at the end of this year, at the end of 2021, Microsoft Academic will be discontinued. You probably all know that Microsoft provided a highly valuable service to all of us by making lots of bibliographic metadata openly available through the Microsoft Academic platform. Data that was obtained partly from publishers, but it was also scraped from the web. This service will be discontinued, unfortunately. That's a pity. At the same time, it also raises many interesting questions about new infrastructures that perhaps could be established and that might actually offer services that could be of even more value than what Microsoft at the moment is providing. A final development that we will also cover in today's session is the increased attention that is being given to governance of community-owned infrastructures. So I already mentioned Crossref as one of these infrastructures. Infrastructures that are managed by the scholarly community in some way. And more and more attention has been given to ways in which this type of community governance can be properly organized, and in particular the so-called principles for open scholarly infrastructure are increasingly being adopted by different infrastructure organizations to implement the idea of community governance. So these are a number of important developments that have taken place over the past year. We won't have time in this session to cover all of these developments in full detail, but we will zoom in on some of the really major things that are happening at the moment. So I would like to briefly introduce the speakers that we have today, and I'm really delighted that we have three world-leading experts in this area of open metadata. We have Bianca Kramer, who will be our first speaker from Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She works at the university library, and Bianca, as I guess many of you know, she's a world-leading open science advocate. So it's great to have you in the session today, Bianca. We also have Cameron Neylon, Professor of Research Communication at Curtin University in Australia. Cameron is one of the leaders of the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative, an initiative, in my view, a really interesting, innovative initiative that is promoting open knowledge in the world of higher education. The third speaker that we have is Ginny Hendricks from Crossref, Director of Member and Community Outreach at Crossref. Ginny is playing a really important role in all these developments around openness of metadata. She's, for instance, the founder of the Metadata 2020 initiative. So it's great to have you as well in this session today, Ginny, as one of our speakers. We will have two presentations, the first one by Bianca, the second one by Cameron and Ginny. I would like to invite all of you, everyone in this session, to share your questions in the chat. We will use the last 20-25 minutes for Q&A. So in the last part of the session, our experts, Bianca, Cameron and Ginny will try to answer all questions you have for them. So please don't hesitate to enter your questions in the chat. I would like to start now with the first presentation by Bianca Kramer about Microsoft Academic and the discontinuation of Microsoft Academic. Bianca, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Ludo, for this introduction. I will indeed talk in this first part of the presentation on an analysis I did together with Cameron Neylon on what we actually lose with Microsoft Academic. And I would like to frame that, not just show you the data, but really frame that also along the questions, how did Microsoft Academic get their data, how did they make it available, and what does that mean for any efforts to replace Microsoft Academic. The presentation will have a lot of data, more than I will cover in this presentation. It is available online, and at the end of the presentation, we'll also share the link, so you can always go back to see what I didn't talk about today. So what's the issue? As Ludo already mentioned, Microsoft announced that Microsoft Academic Graph and Microsoft Academic Search Engine will be supported until the end of this year, and after that will be retired. Now, as Ludo said, Microsoft Academic Graph has been an important source of data and information for a lot of us in doing analysis, in developing tools and platforms, ingesting their data and putting them to different users. And it has been great for that because, unlike a lot of other databases, Microsoft did make the data available under a mostly open license, enabling all that reuse and all that further development. Also, much of the technology is open source, so it can be adapted or rebuilt. And several groups actually at the moment are working on rebuilding Microsoft Academic. There are some aspects of that to consider and to take into account, because the way Microsoft Academic got their data was partly based on license to content that will be difficult to replace or renegotiate, and also dependent on the Bing infrastructure to get all this information. So any replacement will need to work smarter. They can reuse some of the code and some of the mechanism, but not all of them. So they have to use smarter. And especially if we also want to reach beyond the core academic outputs to cover content beyond DOIs. And I'll get more into that in the rest of the presentation. So one approach to that could be again, scraping metadata, scraping information from semi-structured metadata or full text. At the same time, as Ludo also mentioned, there have been a lot of developments recently providing more structured open metadata. Ludo mentioned initiative for open abstract, initiative for open citations, so that could be a complementary route to create not just a replacement of MAC, but really a rich open metadata environment. So when we lose MAC, will we be able to rebuild MAC, or will we even be able to rebuild into something better? What we will need for that, and how can that be organized? That's really the framing of a lot of what we'll be talking about, what I will be talking about, and also partly Cameron and Ginny later. So can we rebuild MAC? Possibly, but how would we know whether that's complete? Do we know what's in MAC to start with? And what content do we have or do we currently not have to build a similar or even a better infrastructure? And to establish that, that's why Cameron and I did the analysis comparing Microsoft Academic metadata to what's currently openly available in Crossref. So quick segue on the data and the data provision. The Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative from Cameron and colleagues that we used also to as the infrastructure for the data and the data analysis. It's an organization, an initiative providing data, information and capacity for, among other players, mostly institutions, to really tell different stories about themselves, placing open knowledge at the heart of that narrative. What that means in practice is that that COCI collects a lot of data from open data sources, integrates them, builds analysis pipelines on them, and thus enables generating a lot of information based on open data. An example of that is the public country dashboard for open access coverage, and it can be used for many other purposes. In our case, it's especially useful because the focus on not just having all these data and doing analysis on them, but really in collecting the data and making them available, focusing on provenance and transparency. And that's what makes it especially good for our current analysis, comparing Microsoft Academic with Crossref metadata. Who has what and what do we lose? So very briefly, I won't go into all of this, but we made use of the Crossref metadata corpus, of the Microsoft Academic corpus, and we mapped them on each other to see what the differences are in metadata coverage and what added value Microsoft Academic has. And for that, we looked at affiliations, at abstract, citations, citations to records, open references in records, and subject classifications, split by publication type and year of publication. So when we look at the full corpus of both Crossref and Microsoft Academic, what we can see is that of the full Crossref corpus, all the DOIs in Crossref, Microsoft Academic has about 75 to 80% of those are covered in Microsoft Academic and could thus potentially benefit from additional metadata that Microsoft Academic has on those DOIs. In addition to that, there's a large corpus of records that are in Microsoft Academic, but not in Crossref, either because they have DOIs from different DOI registers like DataCite or the Chinese and Japanese DOI registers, and also a large corpus of material that's only in MAC. We'll focus mostly on the bottom part, so what's currently in Crossref. What's currently in Crossref and could benefit from additional metadata that Microsoft Academic has on it. At the very end, I'll briefly say something about this other part of the corpus. So where I said that Microsoft Academic has metadata for about 80%, 75 to 80% of the content in Crossref, that's really a stable percentage over the years. It's not the case that Microsoft Academic primarily covers the most recent data or is strong in coverage of older records is really that percentage of what Microsoft Academic has is really stable over the years. When we look at the coverage of Microsoft Academic of what's in Crossref divided by publication type, coverage of journal articles and proceeding articles is pretty high and is lower for a number of other article types that are in Crossref, meaning that also the potential for Microsoft Academic to have additional metadata for these publication types is highest for, again, journal type articles and proceedings articles, but also there's potential for all these other publication types. And what does that look like in practice? When we look at those different metadata types, affiliations, abstracts, and citations, what we can see when we look at all that's in Crossref, that coverage of affiliations and abstracts is still relatively low. There are currently developments aimed at increasing that. Ludo, of course, mentioned the initiative for open abstracts. The integration of the ROR identifier also will hopefully up the ante on coverage of affiliations, but currently it's still quite low. And we see that there, especially, Microsoft Academic has a large added value, meaning that for a lot of records that lack affiliation information and lack abstracts in Crossref, Microsoft Academic does have this information. This is the added value of Microsoft Academic is far less great for citations, and this is in large part due to the success of the initiative for open citations, meaning that the coverage of citations in Crossref at the moment is already quite high. I'll show you some more data about that later on. So this is for all content. When we look at more recent content, so content of the last 3 years, counting, what's interesting is to see that coverage of both affiliations and abstracts is a bit higher in Crossref for recent years, but still Microsoft Academic has quite a large added value. And of course, citations to records is coverage that is lower for more recent records because citations take time to accrue. So more recent publications less often have citations. So there's no surprise there. Very briefly, looking into the differences between different publication types for these different metadata types. And I won't go into all of that. This is something you can have a deeper dive into yourself if you're interested. But it's again here you see that, for instance, for affiliations, that coverage in Crossref, the blue bars, is relatively high for journal articles, proceeding articles, and also for posted content. And you can also see where Microsoft Academic has specific added value. Even more pronounced for abstracts, where you can both see the low coverage in Crossref, the high added value in Mac, also for reports, interestingly enough. And what I'm personally very happy about is to see the very high coverage of abstracts in preprints. So preprint servers using Crossref already provide most of their abstracts, which is really good to see. I'll skip the numbers on citations because I want to dive a little bit deeper into the citations with a closer look at different publishers and explain a little bit more about the issue with citations that we currently still have. Because yes, coverage of citations is quite high in Crossref. A large number of publishers now do supply citations to Crossref. However, we're still faced with two issues. One of them is that some publishers still don't make their references openly available in Crossref. The largest one holding out is still IEEE. Also APA is still holding out, so those references are missing. But in addition, even publishers who do supply open references to Crossref do that only for a subset of their records. And when we look at the added value of Mac in this respect, that could lie into two areas. One, having citations for those publishers that don't provide citations at all to Crossref, like we can see for IEEE, When you include references from MAC, the percentage of coverage jumps up considerably for IEEE and also for APA. And there's a much more limited effect on the citation information that MAC has for publishers that already supply information to Crossref, of any citations that they might not supply to Crossref, but Microsoft Academic does have. That effect is much more limited. It really depends on the publisher. Another thing to mention here, that it's great that those citations are available from Microsoft Academic, but they can, for instance, not be included into the open citation corpus that makes them available for further usage, because they're shared by Microsoft Academic with an ODC BY license, which requires attribution, and thus, because of the problems with attribution stacking, makes it harder for these data to be reused. And open citations requires public domain or CC0, so they cannot be ingested. So the license something is shared on does have a clear effect on how it can be reused. Another thing I briefly want to address is that even though we have seen that Microsoft Academic has added value in terms of affiliations, in terms of abstracts, in terms of citations to some extent, there are also biases in that coverage. What you can see here is, for instance, affiliation coverage by journal category, looking at all journals, journals in the directory of open access, or full open access journals, and then split out by APC charging journals and non-APC charging journals, diamond journals. And especially for Microsoft Academic, the take-home message from this graph is that the amount of affiliation information coverage, so articles that do have affiliation information in their metadata in Microsoft Academic, is much lower for the non-APC charging journals, which are often the smaller journals from smaller publishers, than for the APC charging journals, which points to really a bias in coverage, in detection, in gathering that information. And this is one area where I think, when we say what can we do to replace MAC, this is one area where we could pay close attention to and really make sure we do better than that and address those biases in the data themselves. In view of time, I'm also going to skip that because I really want to focus on some of the conclusions. Yes, Microsoft Academic is a great resource. Its openness will enable us to build back better. There are challenges in systematically gaining the underlying information to replicate some of the aspects of MAC. There are big improvements that have been made over the last years in providing structured metadata. For instance, the WOR identifiers for affiliation, ORCID, ARFOC, ARFOA, that have great potential to improve metadata coverage. There will still be gaps that need to be filled, also backfilled, and that's where still using semi-structured metadata, scraping full text, can be critical and perhaps even essential to make this happen. So both availability of open structured metadata provided at source and availability to full text to also supplement those metadata are both important approaches to replacing something like Microsoft Academic to build back better. And the big gaps and underrepresented area, as I've shown you. In addition, when we think about what any replacement should look like, or basically what any type of open metadata infrastructure should look like to safeguard sustainability, to safeguard transparent data collection and provenance, are the principles of open scholarly infrastructure that deal with transparency, that deal with community governance, and that deal with an insurance plan for long-term availability. So we feel that any effort towards building this type of infrastructure should really comply to the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. And with that, I think it's a good moment to hand over to Cameron to say more about these principles.
Bianca, thanks a lot for this extremely useful overview of what Microsoft Academic offers to us and also the possible replacements that we have. And indeed, we will now continue with the second presentation about the principles of open scholarly infrastructure. So we will move from discussions about data, availability of data, biases in data, etc., to a discussion about actually the way in which these types of infrastructures can be organized, in particular the governance of these infrastructures. And this will be a joint presentation by Cameron and by Ginny. And Cameron will start. So Cameron, the floor is yours.
Thank you. And I will just grab the right slide. So thanks for the opportunity to speak to you. So I'm going to talk about the principles, which I co-authored with Jennifer Lynn and Jeffrey Bilder. But I want to start by asking you all to cast your mind back to 2015 and think about where you were, think about what was happening. Because what struck me as I was preparing this talk and thinking about what was happening in 2015 was that my first memory of where I was and what I was doing was actually completely wrong. That I had my timelines completely mixed up, that I had the dates of various events somewhat confused. And so it really struck me that what we're talking about when we're talking about scholarly metadata is a memory institution. It's our collective memory of the academic record, of the knowledge that we're trying to create. And we build these systems and we build these structures and infrastructures because our memory is not trustworthy, because we need good record keeping, because we need systems that provide the evidence and the reliability to assure us that we're not simply reconstructing where we thought we were, what we were doing, or indeed who we were talking to in 2015, as an example. So one of the things I did in 2015 was to press the publish button on this blog post. And it was a really interesting process. We got a lot of positive responses to that. And then to a certain extent, things went quiet until, as Ludo mentioned, recently there's been a real uptick in interest in application and the public application of these principles. The reason I was thinking about 2015 was to really try and reconstruct in my mind what it was we were doing and why we set out to write these in the first places. The interesting story, we wrote them. The three of us went on a retreat in late 2014. I know it was late 2014 because it included my birthday. And if you need to know when my birthday is, then ask Rodrigo Costas, because it's the same as his birthday. And we actually set out to do something quite different. We actually set out to address what we thought was a big concern, what still is in many ways a concern, of the ability of users of metadata to be able to correct the existing records, to update, curate, and manage those metadata records in a way that was more flexible and more future-proof. And the reason we were starting to think about that was because we'd seen the success that ORCID in particular was starting to become after an awful lot of work. And we realized that in our minds, what we were working towards and thinking about was an infrastructure. It's an infrastructure somewhat similar to what Crossref are now trying to do with community curated data. And this was a hard problem. And having been through the experience of being part of and working towards making ORCID feasible, possible, largely from the side, certainly from my perspective, but being there as a supporter and an encourager of what was going on, there was really the sense that we did not want to go through the process of building another organization. And indeed, if we had to build another organization to develop this imaginary infrastructure that we had in our heads, we wanted it to be the last time anyone would have to do it. So the real question was, how could we think about that? How could we build an organisation or an institution that learnt from the experience of building the trust and the community and the sustainability models that Crossref in an earlier stage and ORCID had worked through? What could we learn from those? What could we say about how to do this well? And what would that look like? What would it mean for an institution or an organisation to be able to have the trust of communities? Could we get there faster than ORCID had? Could we get there faster than Crossref had? And remember, again, around 2015 was one of those waves of a bunch of these startups and exciting technical innovations being purchased by large commercial players. And so there was a real lack of trust, certainly among those interested in community infrastructures, in simply trusting that a new tool, a new system, a new service, a new infrastructure would continue to be there in the medium to longer term. And what we thought was at the core of this, and what I still certainly believe, I think the three of us still believe, was really at the core of this and really motivated what the principles were about, was the idea of building a trustworthy organisation. And this term, trustworthy, is particular to Jeffrey Bilder, where he really wanted to make the point that it's not about trust, because trust is something you earn over time and can lose very easily. It's not a quality of an organisation. It's something that a community entrusts an organisation with. So if you're the organisation, it's not something you can build. What you can build are the systems that make you trustworthy, and hope over time that through that process, through that signalling, through that earning of the belief and confidence of the community, that you earn trust over time. And that's really at the core of what the principles are about. The principles were about the concept that fundamentally, when we're talking about infrastructure, that the base layer of an infrastructure is trust, trusting that it will still be there, trusting that you can build on it, and trusting that it will be reliable as a partner and a support for the work that you're otherwise trying to do. So what does a trustworthy organisation look like, and how does that trust build up? And so there are kind of three layers to this from the way I think about it and the way I think about it now. One is that it has to actually embody the interests, the belief, and the needs of the community that you're hoping will trust it. That means community governance, it means control over priorities and direction setting, and it also means sustainability, because the first layer of trust for anything you're going to use is that it's still going to be there tomorrow and in a year's time and in 5 years' time. The second layer, which we've talked about in different ways over time, but I think this is an important aspect of it that is sometimes missed by those looking at the details of the principles and saying, oh, that one's a bit hard, is that we felt the need to embed signals in the principles. Signals that if an organisation stopped doing something, if an organisation chose not to release its books, chose to stop releasing open source code, that these are signals that something's not quite right, that the community would see, would pay attention to, and would be a precursor to things potentially going wrong, things going in the wrong direction, or the organisation failing due to some sort of financial issue or other things like that. So a lot of what's in the principles are also about signalling, and you can call it virtue signalling if you want to, but it was also about creating the kinds of signals that something might be going wrong and that something would need to be attended to. And then the third part of this is the ability to do something about it. It's all very well having a danger signal and worrying that an organisation that you want to trust and need to trust is going off the rails. but what can you actually do about that if things go really wrong, or even if you're just trying to fix, improve, and support a transition back to a true community system and infrastructure. So these three layers, I think, are, for me, another way of looking at the principles. The principles themselves focus on these three areas of activity of operations. They are very operational in their nature. And so I'm not going to go through and read all of these, but you can see that some of these involve ensuring that the community has a stake, has an interest, has a role in setting priorities, that being an infrastructure, that it's covering the whole of the research enterprise, that it operates transparently, and has the right kinds of revenue model that align the internal incentives of the organisation and the people that work for it and work with it, with those of the community. But also some of these things are also some of these danger signs. So we talk about the goal to generate a surplus. That's an important aspect and signal that the organisation can continue to develop over time. But also if it's not generating a surplus, then you should be starting to ask some questions around the sustainability and is it being financially well managed. Things like open source and open data are there both as signals. Again, if the data is not being made regularly available, that suggests maybe things are not going well, or something's going wrong, or maybe there are people with being suborned or data being taken out of the system. But equally, if the data is available, then the community can, in an extreme case, fork the entirety of the infrastructure and build it again. And that seemed, again, to us very important. This is the place where people most often struggle to feel comfortable with that as something they can commit to up front. And I think, as Ginny is going to talk about, the other thing to emphasize is these are all aspirational. Adopting the principles doesn't mean you're doing all of these perfectly today. In fact, none of the organizations that have in the past signed up to, agreed to, or are signing up to are really delivering on every aspect of all of these principles. And in fact, it's a process of improving and working over time. Again, if the core of this is trust is not something you earn once. It is something you continue to earn over time by continually doing better. And that really fundamentally is at the core of all of this. Building organizations and systems, technical and social, that we can trust to hold the memory that makes up some of our knowledge systems. So with that, I'm going to pass over to Ginny, who's going to talk about a little bit more of this being applied in practice.
Thank you, Cameron. And I'm going to check that I can move the slides on. And can everyone hear me okay?
You do, Ginny.
I'm assuming yes. Great. I just wasn't sure how many people had heard of Crossref, so I thought I'd mention a little bit about who we are, but also just a little bit about what our vision is and how thinking about that has led to our interest in the POSI principles. So we're all about making connections between research objects, so inputs and outputs. We're all about open metadata, and we want to see, not just alone, but we play a part in this global goal to have a scholarly record that everyone can build on for the benefit of society. So what we do is across borders and across subject areas, and even though Crossref was initially conceived as a publisher to publisher linking mechanism, that's grown far beyond, just as publishers have, the definition of publishing has diversified hugely. So this community if I can use that word, includes libraries and repositories, and includes museums and pharmaceutical companies and funders, as well as all of the traditional publishers that you can mention. And how do we see Crossref's part in reaching that global goal? Open and available metadata, both human and machine readable, and we're working on a number of initiatives to highlight the importance of open metadata, including the Metadata 2020 work and pledge, and of course working with the initiative for open citations and open abstracts, to name just two specific groups. We need to have persistent identifiers. So that includes for not just outputs, but also inputs like protocols and methods, and for activities like contributor roles and peer review, and also, review of grant applications. So linking all of those things together is made much easier by having persistent identifiers. And I mentioned the community awareness is a big part of the work that Crossref does as well, with all of these sort of partners. And a key piece to us kind of furthering this vision is the self-assessment that we recently did to see how we stack up against these principles that Cameron just walked us through. And we actually found, we hear the word principles a lot. There are a lot of principles, and it's easy to sign up to principles, but we found them very sort of grassroots, from, we were looking at even like HR practices, and we found them very practical rules, actually. So it was quite easy for us to go through each 16 and just see where we stack up. And we published a blog post at the end of last year where you can see we use sort of a traffic light system. And there are a number of areas where Crossref is sort of amber, so not quite there yet, and there's one area where we are red, so definitely not close, and that was the broad stakeholder governance. And I just give a little bit of information about the lead up to our adopting POSI. It came thinking back to 2015, as Cameron was just doing, that was me just first joining Crossref as Cameron, Jennifer and Jeffrey were on their retreat, which also seems like an impossible thing to imagine these days, is actually meeting people in person and having the time and space to think about things. But we've managed to do a lot of thinking the last couple of years, and in the environment of the pandemic that we've all been trying to struggle through, we were looking at how our organization is going to withstand the pressures that may come out of this, both economic and just practical. How are we going to keep our staff interested, motivated, balanced, happy? And we looked to our board for support in thinking about how we could partner with others to kind of look at joining up for better, efficient operations, for example. And the board agreed and voted to have a strategy committee set up, and that was set up about a year ago. And one of the first things that group did was suggest that the POSI principles might be a good way for Crossref to make a public statement about how it plans to address all types of sustainability, not just financial, not just technical, and to make public promises that Cameron mentioned about how what we're going to do to hold ourselves to account, ask to be held publicly to account, and also potentially look at which other initiatives and organizations are like-minded and would also consider evaluating themselves against POSI with a view to, okay, we have similar goals, we operate similarly and want to kind of go on the same path. could we do things together more formally? And this slide actually goes through why POSI, and it's not just because one of the authors was employed here and the other author used to be employed at Crossref. There's many reasons that we sort of kept coming back to POSI, and yeah, one of them was just that it was just really practical and easy to understand. It wasn't sort of lofty principles, and even though some of the words used in it, you know, like principle, even the word infrastructure, are slightly debatable about what those definitions are. Even governance, even community. It gave us an opportunity as a leadership team and as a board to consider what we mean by those things and what's important to us with those aspects of our operation. So we also noticed that it had been really well received by the community in the 5 years. It only took 5 years for Crossref to sort of look at POSI ourselves, and that, you know, that reflects a bit of an evolution with our community as well, and with our board and our members. And as I said, we had a need for a broader governance, and we were looking for ways to signal to the community that Crossref is open to be broadened out if other parties are interested in helping to manage us. And we really liked as well that they were quite balanced. Like, it wasn't just a sort of a checklist, even though we're doing this sort of traffic light signal system, but you can't really have just one without the other. And I think that's where some of the other principles maybe are a bit narrow, is that they focus maybe only on open data or metadata, or only on governance. So it was really sort of interesting to have something that seemed to kind of consider you know, if something goes wrong with governance, well, there's insurance to for the community or anyone to kind of take open code and run with it. So we've embraced POSI. I think that's clear. And we announced it. And I don't think Cameron mentioned who. It was a little bit of a snowball effect. And of course, we were having close conversations with people. And we saw Dryad sign up and do a self-assessment. So a public promise, and RAW, the Research Organizations Registry, did the same thing. And we had the Journal of Open Source Software, and our research, Open Citations, and most recently DataCite as well. And I think, I can't speak for all of those, but it seems to be a very good signal, even just to each other, that we're sort of committed to these principles, and also committed to supporting each other on our kind of journeys to reaching these goals. So I think I'll just finish up on what we're actually doing, because I've mentioned a lot about how they're practical. So in practice, we did a stakeholder review, and that's not just looking at who pays Crossref, like who is a paying member, who pays for, you know, increased, guaranteed metadata provision. It's really looking at who, if a decision is made at Crossref, who will be affected. So that's much, much broader than the initial, you know, who we immediately think of as Crossref members or the Crossref community. And one big decision we did make was to, based on that stakeholder review, was to add research funders to our governing board. So that's what's happening this year. We had a call out, and we specifically asked some of our funder members to put their hat in the ring, and they've written statements, and that's all going up in the next week or so. And we have a board election every November, and all of the members will be able to vote. And we're hoping that the funder that's on the slate will get a seat on the board. So that'll be huge for Crossref. Always thought of as a, you know, publisher-driven, publisher-started organisation, is really actively broadening out. On the sustainability side, we have set up an investment committee, and we're working towards a 12-month contingency fund specifically, so if we stop making a surplus, and luckily we do, we will have 12 months to fall back on, and 12 months for, if there's an emergency, 12 months for the community to figure out what they want to do with Crossref, if they want to take it over or whatever. And we're also publishing a lot more about our operations. So things like, staff handbooks and how we onboard our members, how we decide whether a membership should be terminated, things like that. And of course, open code and open support and bug fixing and issues and things like that. So I think I will end it really with just a bit of a call for others who are interested in this area to consider that the parties that you work with, the underlying tools and platforms and services that you work with, how would they stack up against the POSI principles, and put the question to them. And I think, Ludo, are we sort of finishing here and looking for some questions and discussion maybe?
Definitely. Thank you, Ginny. Thank you, Cameron. It's really fascinating to see all this thinking behind the POSI principles and the impressive work at Crossref to actually adopt these principles. We will now move to Q&A, and we have a number of questions from the audience. So let's see how many we can cover. So what we will do is we will go to the first question. So we have a question about the POSI principles, and the question is whether commercial players that maintain proprietary infrastructures, whether they could also adopt POSI principles. So I guess that's a question that perhaps, Cameron, you could try to address.
I can certainly take a shot at it. So in the original blog post, we worked through a set of examples where we tried to think of what the right kind of governance structures would look like. And where our experience was more with not-for-profit systems. But our belief is that there is nothing to do with the tax status of an organization that prevents it from being an open infrastructure. The key aspect is this community governance. And indeed the openness of the code and the data. So there, in terms of it being an infrastructure that is fully under the open infrastructure principles, for a commercial player that wants to retain some aspects of its intellectual property in a proprietary form, you'd have to carve out the infrastructure piece and make the data and code available and actually rerunnable. And so, but that's, and to think about what community governance would really mean in that context. And I don't mean just creating an advisory board and then ignoring it. I mean, really engaging with a process of community governance. But commercial players like Ubiquity Press is a good example of working towards this through community covenants, through customer covenants, and making real commitments to how they're going to operate and what is in that open space. And the alternative, of course, is to provide these things as a service in a market relationship. And that's also fine. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just a different kind of thing. And we would argue there needs to be a different kind of relationship in that case. But there's absolutely nothing in principle that prevents a commercial organization from providing an open infrastructure. We think there are viable financial models for that to work. And there are a bunch of the details to work through, which are not always comfortable for a commercial organization in its traditional kinds of forms. But there are examples of this working in some quite interesting ways now. So it certainly shouldn't be ruled out. And I think there's some real opportunities there, actually.
Thank you, Cameron. I would like to go to the next question that we have from the audience. I think probably, Bianca, this is a question where you could try to give a response. So the question is, we are discussing today open metadata of scholarly outputs. The conference is about science and technology innovation indicators. The question is, to what extent actually will openness of this metadata enable us to make better indicators or to use these indicators in a better way? could you, Bianca, try to say something about that?
Always try to say something. I think one of the things here is the issue of provenance and transparency. If the data that we use for research assessment or for developing these indicators, if the data themselves are open with clear provenance and transparent, I think that makes any kind of assessment built on those data much stronger. So I think that that's one aspect. And the other aspect is also the opportunity with open metadata to build new systems and new tools on that is much larger, and the possibility for collaboration on that is much larger than with closed source of data. And the third aspect has to do with those biases that are addressed. We know that a number of the systems and sources of metadata or data that we use have clear biases based on how they select their content, how they select their coverage. And I do think that the possibility of using open metadata, the possibility of combining those data has at least the opportunity to do something about these biases and make the data and thus also the analysis and build upon those data more fair and more equitable.
It's interesting, Bianca, because we actually have another question which was about these biases that you were just referring to. Perhaps you could say a bit more, Bianca, about how exactly open structures could address these types of biases. Your idea on the way in which open infrastructures could do better in terms of getting rid of such biases.
No, one example of biases is, dealing with two cameras here. One example of such biases is coverage, for instance, in Web of Science and Scopus of, sources selected on impact, that's one thing, but in practice also sources selected bias towards more Western countries, Western output, English-speaking outputs. So that's a clear bias. Of course, that's a choice of these sources, and we can't really do anything about it, but except putting it up for discussion. But with an open infrastructure and open source, we have the ability to add to that from other sources. It's not limited to the one provider who makes those choices. It being open implies that it can be used by others and added to by others. So and also to have it inspected by everyone and to analyze those existing biases.
Thanks for that, Bianca. I would like to ask Ginny if she perhaps also wants to say something about that, given the role of Crossref as, of course, a major player in this infrastructure landscape. So how do you, Ginny, from the Crossref point of view, look at this issue of biases and perhaps some parts of the scholarly literature not being in structures, perhaps also in Crossref?
Yeah, so, the Crossref's data is provided by its members, and you have to be a member to put your metadata in there. It's all open by default, apart from, as we know, for historic reasons, some of the references. That is changing. It needs to all be open, and that should happen soon. And our approach really is, if you put it into Crossref, it's, you do that in order to distribute it for various uses, including assessment and indicators and rankings and whatever really anyone wants to use that data for. But we know that Crossref, of course, doesn't have everything. Not everyone can join, and so our take is more, how can we lower the barriers to participation for, countries that don't have strong access to online publishing platforms, or don't have the strong support of a kind of education policy or science policy at the government level. So we are doing lots of kind of partnerships with people like the Directory for Open Access Journals and others to see where the gaps are, to try and at least make it possible for all sorts of players of all size to participate in Crossref. And another thing about sort of, just to build on what Bianca was saying, obviously the FAIR principles are brilliant. The open and available data is critical. And added to that, if you can see the provenance behind how that data was collected, when that data was collected, and I don't know if it's relevant to mention the event data service here, which isn't traditional citations, but it is mentions, shares, other kinds of attention that is paid to research works, and that specifically has a sort of timestamps, footprint, and an evidence record. And I think that providing that kind of thing, as well as the data itself being open, but how the data was gathered, who did what to it, if it was normalized, where it went, if it was cleaned, if it was merged, all of that kind of stuff is really going to be critical. But I feel like that's just starting to become a trend, is the sort of the data behind the data being open.
Thank you, Ginny. We are reaching the end of this session. We won't be able, I'm afraid, to cover all questions, but I have one final question for which I would like to invite you, Cameron, to give a brief answer before we close this session. So someone in the audience is asking about this concept of community that you're mentioning, and actually this person is asking for some clarification on what actually is a community, or how could a community be defined? Could you say something about that, Cameron, in a kind of brief way before we end the session?
Solve it quickly. I would have done so. We ducked the question in the principles because it's hard. The short answer is the community is the community for whom the infrastructure is infrastructural. That's not actually very helpful, but in the same way that Ginny was talking about Crossref doing a stakeholder analysis, trying to figure out who is important but not at the table, that work of engaging community, identifying who is affected and bringing them into the conversation is a key part of building that trust up. And it depends on the infrastructure itself, on the organisation itself. Look for some work coming out by Asura Enkbaya from Invest in Open Infrastructure, doing some really interesting work that might help illuminate this and make it more practical in the future.
Thank you, Cameron. That was actually quite a helpful answer for me, at least. Thanks for that. Okay, we need to end the session. I would like to thank all three speakers, Ginny, Bianca, Cameron. Thank you all for being here today. I would like to thank everyone in the audience for joining. I also, as a final word, would like to say that clearly we are in a kind of development towards more and more openness of all kinds of metadata, open infrastructures, etc. I know that many of us in the community care about this, and I would like to basically end by making an open invitation to everyone in this session today to consider supporting initiatives aimed at openness of infrastructures. I hope that the discussion today made clear ways in which we can all contribute to these developments. Perhaps some of you are managing organizations that might consider adopting the policy principles. Perhaps some of us could contribute to some of the open metadata initiatives that are ongoing. And I'm sure that Cameron, Bianca, and Ginny will be very happy to discuss these things in more detail if you reach out to them. Thank you all for joining today, and enjoy the rest of the conference.